So welcome everyone who are on the screen with their cameras on and people who are listening in. Thank you for joining today. We've got a pretty amazing panel, and I'll probably quickly go around and introduce each one of them. So if you can wave at the camera when I introduce. So let's start with Paul Masek. He's the VP and head of shared services at T. Rowe Price. He's focused on APIs, microservices, CRM, has 25 plus years of experience across wealth management, consulting, and also economic research. He's married and has two lovely children and also a German Shepherd, which he often calls a trouble, who can be found at a bike indoor or outdoor. So that's good going for you, Paul. So that's Paul. We got Tyler, who is a principal financial services specialist at AWS or Amazon. He's been building consulting organizations for the past 20 years, focused heavily on capital market space. He has led multiple programs in fixed income, equity, derivative trading, risk management systems, and the list goes on. He also happens to be an ex-Lab 49, where he was the global head of engineering for a long time. So welcome, Tyler. We got Marty Pitt, who is a developer, architect, technology leader. He's also the CTO of Orbital. So guys, go and check out a pretty cool company, largely focused on building autonomous API and data gateway. He's also the creator of Taxi and TaxiQL, which is sort of an open source, a really cool specification, also worth checking out, and we'll hopefully talk about some of it today. He's also an ex-Lab 49, so welcome, Marty. And then finally, we have Zohaib Khwaja. He's an AI specialist and partner solution architect at AWS. He specializes in computer vision and generative AI. Outside of AWS, he's also an educator, teaches AI courses at community colleges in Houston and UPenn. So welcome, Zohaib. So with that, let me do a little bit of a setup, right? And we can just open it up for the panelists, and it's a fireside chat. So we'll hopefully just have a conversation and people can jump in. There'll be a Q&A at the end. So people on the audience, you can submit your questions and we can take up the questions at the end, right? So why are we even talking about APIs, right? Like, don't we already have 2 decades of deep reflection on this, right? Like, after all, we have the tools and standards necessary to produce APIs, right? We have REST, we have GraphQL, we have protobuf. We also can consume APIs, right, pretty effectively. If you're from Java world, you write Spring REST templates. If you're from JavaScript, you probably use Axios. We also have developed sophisticated API management blueprint, right? We have Apigee, we have AWS API Gateway, we have Kong. So why are we still talking about it, right? And I think there's something more sinister going on under the hood. And I use the word sinister. I know it's a bit dramatic, but you will see why. And I do think there's something sinister, right? Which is happening under the hood, which is that with all of this progress made, we are still somewhere failing collectively as an industry, right? And that's what we are here to explore today with our panelists, right? And here's how the story goes in my head, right? Imagine we are a developer, and I think we can all imagine on this conversation topic, right? And we are given a story, right? So we are from finance. Say the story is simple. You got to show a user's accounts, their positions, and their last 20 transactions, right? Seemingly non-threatening, benign use case, right? And as a developer, you immediately run into a problem, right? Which is, oh, so I need to get the accounts, I need to get the positions. Where do I get it from? Which API to call, right? If you're lucky, you probably have a very smart tech lead with 20 plus years of experience at an organization, and they'll tell you, yeah, go and look at that account service there, right? And you will get the data. And as a developer, you go there, you open up your Postman, and you start sort of hitting that API. And you quickly realize that it doesn't have all the information, right? So maybe there's another service called account details service that has account details, right? And then there's another service called transaction service that needs some of the account service data to call the transaction service and then to call the position service. You see where the story goes, right? And you struggle, right? You're groping in the dark almost, right? And that is if you're lucky to have a good tech lead. If not, you're going to your product owner who's going to point you to a team. And this is like the web of sort of navigation that you as a developer are going through just to find the right APIs. And then when you find the right API, what do? Right? You sort of have to write all of this plumbing code, right? You're going to write a code to loop over the accounts. For every account, go to transactions, get the transactions. For every account, go to positions. In the end, you get all of this data that you're going to reformat because your UI needs it in a specific way. Sometimes we call it BFF, right? Backend for front end. Finally, after all of this, you deploy this in production, right? And if you're lucky, which many of us are not as developers, because production data is different from dev data, right? So you might, in fact, realize that this account service doesn't even give you all the accounts. There's something called sub-account service, right? Which gives you some other accounts that you totally missed, right? Because dev wasn't reflective and you never cared about it. But let's not talk about that problem. That's probably a whole discussion in and of itself. But if you're lucky enough, you get it to production, it works for 2 months, and then the producers decide to change the contract. Now what do? Now your account service would need to be changed. So all the consumers have to literally go back and change their code, right? So to me, this is like there's this ocean of APIs in large organizations. This could be thousands or tens of thousands, right? And you're literally trying to navigate this ocean and you don't have a compass and you don't have Google Maps. So you're literally stranded in this ocean. But what's even more interesting is that when you look around, every other team is also stranded. So literally, your whole organization is on this ocean. They don't have maps, they don't have compass, and they're trying to figure out their way through this. And I think the reason I said we are failing is because I think this is a conversation worth having that not a lot of us are having, which is what we are trying to change today, hopefully, is to talk about this. So with that setup, let's start talking about this problem, right? Why it exists, why is it there, what are the symptoms of it, what is the impact of this on budget, on resource constraints, on predictability, on certainty, and what are the anti-patterns that might emerge? So maybe we start with Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Kruttik. I thought partway in there we were just going to wrap it up. Sounded like we were all good. We got all the tools that we need. Yeah, maybe I'll just kind of start with a little bit of background, maybe on our journey, kind of where we are now, right? To dovetail with some of the things that you mentioned. So, you know, in our organization, we have a long, rich history of building services, N-tier architecture, right? Middle tier, you know, again, middle tier services. You know, we've gone through the technology generations, right? Going back to Corba, and then, you know, here we are, you know, whether it's RESTful or some other, you know, paradigm. And along the way, we've also modernized the stack, right? And so we've scaled in a lot of ways, we've modernized in a lot of ways, but and I think a bit of the problem that you're kind of, you know, teasing out here is, but we didn't really scale, I would say, maybe the learning process. And so when a new developer comes on board, I won't repeat what you went through, great example, but when a new developer comes on board, you know, for us, it is still, we've talked about this a lot, right? It's still an awful lot of who you know. And so you got to figure out who to talk to your point. If you get in touch with a tech lead, fantastic. If you don't, it's going to take you a bit longer. And that works, like we make it work, but it doesn't really scale. And, you know, I was just saying this to, you know, to an internal team yesterday. We love it. We love collaboration, right? People to people collaboration is great, but it's not always the most efficient approach. Okay, so we're on a bit of a journey, you know, starting kind of late last year, if you will, where we said we're going to start to solve some of these problems. And so one way we think we can start to solve a problem is to have something like a portal or an API marketplace for both. And so we're moving in that direction, right? I know you and I have had some conversations, and I think we're kind of like-minded. I think that's going to get us right moving forward. It's going to help. That new developer is going to be able to come in and go to a portal and see, here's all the list of APIs. And they'll see really great documentation, right? Fingers crossed. That's going to take some work in and of itself. But to go from there to, well, wait a minute, I've got to call this API, then I've got to get the results, I've got to do some reformat, and then I've got to call another, I've got to string these things together, I've got to orchestrate these APIs. Understanding how to do that, it could be solved through documentation, and we'll take a stab at it, but I think this is, for us, we know like this is the beginning, this is foundational. Curious, for on this webinar, like other people going through the same thing, I'd love to commiserate. But also, are you also seeing solutions to this? I know those two letters AI are going to come into this somehow, some way. So yeah, I look forward to like the short-term advances we intend to make, but I'm also excited about like what comes after that. And I do think AI it's got to be part of the solution there.
Yeah, others jump in. Marty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really, it's such a huge topic and one that's so dear to my heart. I think, there's a lot of stuff that you touched on that just kind of encapsulates that problem so nicely, right? Like the fact that everybody in the organization is performing this kind of archaeology, this discovery journey over and over and over. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me quite a long time ago is we talk about these API specs, which are these machine readable ways of software describing what it can do, right? Open API is a great way for, we produce these machine readable specs for kind of describing what an API can do. And every organization that I've been to, the very first thing that they do with that machine readable spec is they hand it over to a developer to look at, to start building code with. And the really interesting question is, if we have these machine readable specs that tell us how to interact with another service, like why aren't the machines doing the work to glue this stuff together, right? Like we go, a software developer writes some code to produce a machine readable spec, who gives it to another software developer who reads it to write some code to connect to that thing. Like that's kind of a broken metaphor, right? And I think it breaks down for a couple of reasons that are really interesting, which is that these specs that we create are they're very insular. They do a great job of describing what my service does. So I'm going to tell you in great detail what my service does, but they don't do a great job of describing how my service relates to other services within the organization. And we've seen people have cracks at this in ways. Industries have tried to do this in ways that I think have failed spectacularly. Things like massive enterprise domain models to say, hey, this is the only way to represent a customer, and everyone has to sign up for this representation of a customer. So we need kind of ways that allow teams to remain autonomous and to remain flexible and to kind of own their own domain and own their own way of modeling data and modeling capabilities, but also recognize, to use your great metaphor, that they are but one ship in an ocean, I guess, is where that's going. And so, they have this responsibility to say, hey, this string that I accept on this API call isn't just any old string, but it's a customer number or it's an email address, and some kind of semantic autonomous way for us to describe the capabilities that we're offering and the data we're publishing, not in a way that other teams and other software can understand it, so that we can start building this kind of graph of capability. And I think API catalogs are a great kind of start to that, but really they're just a list of it's just a place to go and get a list of jobs to be done, right? Like an API catalog doesn't build you anything, it just gives you a list of jobs to be done. And so I think what's really interesting is what, as Paul was saying, what readable specs to start creating software that can, those things are changing. And I think that's really kind of the key to start unlocking some of this capability across the enterprise.
Yeah, it's interesting. So first, I want to honor Paul for saying the word Corba. For many on the call will have no idea what that is, but think of gRPC 25 years ago. It's kind of the same thing. I was reflecting. I was with Kruttik's Vineyard, a customer recently that had this massive success of a project because they were finally able to create an API that actually returned all the holdings for funds in a mutual fund family. And I couldn't believe it. I think that's where we are. And I think part of it is, it's interesting. AWS has these leadership principles, and one of them is working backwards. And I think a lot of times APIs are in a working backwards way. Like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So somehow it never came up that we needed a single place to go get the holdings out of, I don't know, some mutual fund or some ETF. Seems sort of obvious. But anyway, it just to underscore the fact that this is still something that's very much top of mind. And also think, you know, a lot of the activity I'm seeing, and I think Zohab will probably echo this, is, you know, we're talking a little bit about cataloging and discovery for APIs. Just remove API and add in the word data. That is also top of mind. And you hear a lot about federated models where you have distributed ownership but centralized access and discovery. I think a lot of the things we say about that relating to data in support of AI and machine learning and other things can also be said for APIs in a very similar way.
Yeah, go ahead, Zoe.
Yeah, I will say that in terms of things that I've worked on previously, I really appreciate Paul for mentioning documentation because that's been prior in a system administration role. It's been the bane of my existence was a lack of documentation. But having APIs with very sufficient documentation, and this is kind of, when I say very sufficient, I mean, even not perfect levels of documentation will end up causing a misunderstanding on an LLM side. So an LLM can go and read the documentations for specific APIs and then be able to, this is just a sample project I'm talking about in the past. An LLM was used to train on all of the API documentation to be able to tell a developer, hey, you're trying to do X. I believe this API or that API would be a good fit for this connection between the two. This sort of thing is already currently being done between the ML services in the SageMaker tree, as well as Recognition, Poly, Lex, and Transcribe, I believe, just those four at the moment. But there was a very big, there's a little funny moment when I realized that not perfect documentation really messes with an LLM's understanding, because you have a lot of APIs that overlap in their functionality. So it'll start recommending ones of like 10 at random, not realizing it's giving the wrong one. But in terms of working backwards, I believe it's very important to at least see the problem, or maybe not a problem, but at least see the pain point of, hey, if you throw a rock in the internet, you'll hit an API, and we need to be able to distinguish between them, and using GenAI approaches definitely helps with that quite a bit, even though we very commonly run into funny issues and funny outcomes like that, where we'll get a API, or we'll get recommended APIs in the incorrect direction or the incorrect domain, or this is the right API but with a wrong cloud service, etc.
Yeah, so I think that's such an interesting point. So like before we jump into the solution a little bit, Zohaib, though, let me get back to the problem that I think Tyler mentioned, which is, why can't we just build better APIs, right? Like why have 5 APIs, right? Which is doing somewhat similar thing. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on this hypothesis that I have. I think it's a vicious cycle, right? So like as a developer, if I have to call 5 services, and if I have to do a lot of work to find 5 services, but if I have access to the database on the side, right? Because not every enterprise is microservices to a point where each service has their own database. Most of the time they're shared database. And I'm like, you know what? I can see the data in the table, right? Like, why go to a service because it's so hard to find them? Let me just go to the database directly, right? And then at that point, you yourself become a producer because you just have access to that data, right? So now you end up exposing that data as another service. And it's sort of a self-perpetuating problem where now you have like producers producing these APIs because they didn't know that other APIs exist, or go back to the producers of those APIs and say, you know what, guys, you should just change your API a little bit. Maybe just add this one thing. And then one thing I'll add there is that the producers are also risk averse because they're like, oh, you know what, if I change the APIs, all the consumers are going to break in my enterprise. How am I going to deal with that? So you know what, let me not change the APIs. So I think that to Tyler's point, I'm just wondering, why is it that large enterprises run into this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of sort of having, if I may say, like a poorly designed API ecosystem to begin with, and work on it? I don't know what thoughts you guys have.
I would, I understand I just spoke, but I like to, this has been noticed before by a variety of people. I like to attribute it to the same reason there are so many different flavors of Linux. That there really is no, even though, yeah, at the end of the day, depending on your use case, they might all just do the same thing for you. So there's a lot of different APIs there's that and the scalability feature. Some APIs were not designed to scale outwards and upwards to millions to billions of calls per day. Some APIs are not designed for a small amount of calls per day. There is a case to be made for, yes, there is an API for your specific use case. And then there is also a case for you just didn't search enough for an API that fits your use case. So it really is up to a business decision maker in a business to say, you know what, let's just make our own and then we can sell it. So there's a lot of those people that try to market theirs. There's also a lot of, hey, you know what? I think that this API is very similar to our use case, but just a little bit different. We need just a new flavor of it. Linux Mint, but just with a little extra flavor on it, and it would fit our use case perfectly. That's how my I'm gonna fairly, let's say, relatively inexperienced eyes views it, and I'm okay with being proven wrong or disagreed with.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, right, that like in my case, for us, for a internal organization, technology organization, building APIs that are primarily consumed internally, you can get away with it. So you can end up with 3 APIs that kind of do the same thing because it's not a monetized, right, product. So I think it starts there. And then I think, Kruttik, I think you more or less described the why, but it's behavioral, right? And so a lot of what happens is it's very project driven, right? And so there's a project and you're on that team and you're asked to, right, build a digital experience that gets the data as you described in that scenario. And as you walk through it, right, that's exactly how it goes. Okay, I've got this assignment. And I've got a deadline. So I'm going to find the quickest way to do this. And if that turns out to be, look, it's easier, faster for me, and I have more control over it for me to build it myself, that's what I'm going to do. I think, and I don't know, we're here to talk about roles in these situations, but I would be curious if other organizations also kind of suffer from there aren't product owners overseeing, for the most part, overseeing APIs, internal APIs. Product owners are very focused, I would say, on the experience. A lot of times they're very focused on data as well. What happens in the middle, bit of a mystery. Trust the technology folks, right, to get it right. And I think that's you put those ingredients together and here we are.
I think part of this kind of leads back to discoverability and the way that we think about approaching building software solutions at the moment, right? And if we think about API catalogs, they are, like I said before, they're a place for kind of listing jobs to be done. Like Kruttik, you gave an example at the beginning of, I guess from Paul's example, what a product owner might say, right? Like given this customer, I can't actually remember what the example was, but it was like 3 pieces of data, right? And we then hand it off to engineers to work out how do I decompose this down into all of the different individual API calls that I need to make, which is a discovery problem, right? They have to work out which are the right services that I have to call, and if I search in the API catalog using slightly the wrong terms, it might look like an API doesn't exist. And I think it's because we're trying to solve discoverability at the let me find the next API that I need to call level, rather than approaching it from a this is the thing that I need to achieve. Because at the end of the day, right, even though it's fun that we can have like 25,000 APIs in my organization, like that doesn't count, right? That doesn't count for anything. No one wants an API. No one needs an API. They need either the data or the capability that API is providing, and they either need it standalone or they need it orchestrated with some other ones, but they don't know that, right? And so we need to find, like, discoverability needs to move up a layer, not to which is the right API that I need to call or what's the collection of right APIs that I need to call, but this is the thing that I'm trying to deliver. This is the thing I'm trying to achieve. And then discoverability from that should be great. In order to achieve X, here's an orchestration of 9 different APIs together that gives you from this thing that you know, like a customer ID, to the collection of attributes that you needed, solving all of the different parts along the way. Like, we need to move our expectation up a level to solutions that we want delivered rather than jobs or pieces of work that we need to do.
I'd be curious.
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Marty, that totally makes sense. I think the question, maybe I'm going to direct it to you, Tyler, is the solution to that a solution to orchestrating all of those existing APIs, or is it design and build better APIs?
Yeah, or maybe it's obvious, probably a bit of both, I think. Yeah, I was thinking, I know Marty mentioned earlier, or he said the word semantic, and I'll just add the word search to the end of it. And, I'm curious if people are seeing, APIs and their signatures and their documentation thrown into something that can be hit from a semantic search or a RAG perspective, to get a more, a broader hit rate or a more accurate hit rate against, basically embedding the JDK into or what is called JavaDoc. Sorry, against ancient thing again, but like embedding JavaDoc into a latent space, and then instead of like searching through a billion rows of a document, going after it that way, and just being able to ask a simple text question about it. The other thing that comes to mind is kind of sequence of events. So a little bit of this is the React framework, not the UI React framework, the other one. But how do you go about getting that information? So to Marty's point, we ultimately were looking for this data to serve this purpose. It may not all come from the same place, but can an LLM or semantic search or a combination of both, maybe LangChain or some tool usage, can that be used to describe the sequence of things you have to do? Because as all of us were, I think, former developers or current developers, we know, we go for a little bit, we're missing this piece of information, then we go for the next bit, we uncover that we're missing another piece of information, and we keep going. Can some of the tools, the developer experience tools, or semantic search, can that help kind of lay out the sequence of things that we would fumble our way through as developers in the course of obtaining the data that we need? And Zoe, I'm curious, are you seeing that?
Truthfully, a little bit, yeah. There's not actually too much to go into that. Yeah, we are absolutely seeing that a little bit.
I think one interesting thing I heard from what you said, Tyler, and I'm thinking out loud here, just from a GenAI perspective, is that every time I see a human doing something, I think there's a hypothesis that LLM can do it. And that's at least the hypothesis, right? So in this particular case, the question is that one tech lead that I was talking about, who had a tribal knowledge, imagine there's a superpowered tech lead who has superpower knowledge about an enterprise. And you're asking it about any API, any data, to Marty, your question, which is, I just need this, dude. Like, can you just tell me? And this super amazing tech lead is the person who can just not only tell you which APIs to call, what are the problems with it, where to go and fetch it, what are the sort of inputs it needs, what is the sequence of it. Maybe it can even build it for you and give it to you, right? That seems like a fairly good hypothesis to have just on a hypothesis perspective. Now, does that answer, Paul, your question, which was about what if you have poorly designed APIs to begin with, right? Like, are we just perpetuating that problem by creating like sort of this Band-Aid? And I don't know, that's a good question, right? Like, do you need that superpowered tech lead who is helping you out with a poorly designed API space? I think probably yes in the short term, but you also don't want to de-incentivize bad behavior either. You want to probably solve the other problem too. But I was wondering what you guys think about this sort of this middle ground of some immediate short-term gains that you can have, assuming that the producer's problem cannot be solved immediately, probably a more longer-term solution.
I don't know if we were supposed to raise our hands or anything like that, but I will say, having personally worked on programs that are meant to attach a service provider to a customer. They were it's basically an LLM that would learn from all of the service providers' prior engagements, get information from it, and try to learn what this service provider specializes in. However, what we notice is regardless of how strong of hardware we use, however more complex of an LLM we use, and however much more training we gave it, there was always a manager or some sales executive or representative with a lot of tribal knowledge. So as someone with extreme tribal knowledge was always able to beat it, no matter what. However, that was like only the best of the best were able to out recommend this LLM, but it would beat like 85% of the sales representatives who were like within 2 years of joining. So it is kind of like it will outperform most of the newer and lesser trained folks. However, it, at least so far as I can tell, is nowhere near close, even replacing any of the best of the best. It really will be a test of how good you really know what you're doing. If you really do understand your partners, if you understand the customers, if you understand the business, the industry, the trends, LLMs will not beat you. LLMs cannot go into that much nuance. That, and if it attempts to go into that nuance, hallucinations happen very frequently. And there are some algorithmic based biases that other people here could probably have already assuming would happen, where it would heavily be biased towards the giant consulting firms that do this for, they do 20 projects a second in America. So it'll be biased towards them just because of the sheer number of engagements they've had. But even a seasoned, like 5+ years of sales manager would be able to know, who would be able to have the tribal knowledge to outperform this LLM 99 times out of 100. That is something I personally have been seeing over in several, and not just AWS, but any company that's tried hey, we have all these customers. We may not have the best knowledge for this, but we have referrals that we can refer to other companies. So let's try to get an LLM to see, we can skip out the meeting times of meeting the partners and seeing what the best fit is. Let's just put all the information in the LLM. LLM was unable to beat, in almost every single case, was unable to beat the person that knows the system.
That's interesting. Can I ask a follow-up question quickly, Zoeb, on that? And maybe that would highlight the contrast, the difference that I think might exist in this case.
Okay.
So I think the case you're talking about is about a nuanced human opinion about a subject, which can go either ways. In other words, it's not deterministic. I think in the case of APIs, there's a sense of determinism, right? Like APIs exist, there's a spec, the spec has data, the other API needs that spec, they produce some, like, in other words, we are talking about what Marty said in the word of structure, which is sort of deterministic. Wouldn't you think that the hallucination problem there could be minimized by using some of the strategies as compared to the use case you brought up? In other words, if I ask a question of an LLM which is factual, would it continue to just be hallucinating 99 out of 100 times or 1 out of 100 times?
I would say if it's a fact-based question, it would be 1 out of 100 times it would hallucinate. If I ask a LLM, what's the weather like today? Well, actually, a lot of them wouldn't be able to tell you today's weather, but if I ask an LLM what is 2 + 2, it will obviously give the right answer 99.999% of the time. However, if I asked an LLM, what would a really dumb person answer 2 + 2 with? There's no way it would be able to determine that. That's a very nuanced question. If it was my father, he would probably make a joke about something that I said when I was really young or something like that. But questions to LLMs in regards to which partners would fit which customers, there's always a little bit of nuance that would require a human's perspective, would require some form of, hey, if the answer is true but begins with I think, an LLM cannot do that. I think these two are a good fit. I would not trust an LLM with coming up to that result.
Yeah.
If I could jump in, I'll go back to Marty where you kind of started, and again, kind of come back to what problem are we trying to solve? And so I love how you walk through, right? We create specs, right? Machine readable, right? Specs. And then what do? We take that. So a person does something to create that. And then we take that and we give that to a person, right? And that sounds odd, because it should be a machine being able to read that, and solve the problem. And so when I think about, and I'm gonna break your metaphor a little bit, Kruttik. So I'll keep with the navigation piece, right? Like, I think and this has been a bit of my thinking, right? Like, we start with the portal and you can one place to see everything. Great. Can we employ AI maybe to help discover the right APIs to use? Can we take the next step and it could help me explain how to orchestrate a couple of APIs? But at the end of the day, ideally, what I want is Google Maps or Waze. Like, I want something to tell me I'm trying to go from A to B. There are 3 ways to go, and I'm on the fastest route possible. And it brings a lot of information in, right? Gives me choices, right? If I don't want to pay tolls, fine, I'll take a different route. So,
But you can have a self-driving car that takes you there, so you don't even have to drive.
now we're really getting.
But that's the difference in the metaphor, right? Is, do you want, like, Google Maps is how do I get from A to B? Turn right, turn left, like detour around this thing. You don't want that, right? You want the thing. You want the self-driving car. Just like, I just want to go from my house to the ice cream shop. Like,
I'm thinking about the tech lead, like we were just talking about. And I think what I heard was, LLM. Hey, they can beat a new developer, but they can't beat a seasoned rock star, right? And so it's a little bit of, what do we want a new developer to aspire to become a rock star, who becomes that person who you have to talk to them to figure out how to orchestrate these APIs? Not really, because now we're not really solving the problem. Growing careers perhaps, but we're not solving problems. So for me, the analogy for Google Maps was, can we get to the point where we have well-defined APIs? They need to be orchestrated, but a machine can figure out how to orchestrate them.
Yeah, and I would argue, in kind of looking, we're at this really interesting point, or this really interesting inflection point, where we, as an industry, LLMs are kind of the shiny new toy, and it feels attractive to try and deploy LLMs to every different problem, right? And LLM will definitely be able to help. And personally, I think LLMs are really great for adding structure and adding or bringing order to unstructured information. So maybe an LLM is useful for helping me create a good API spec and surfacing information how this API relates. But I worry where we create this model where LLMs are building, where we're just using LLMs to build glue code, because you fast forward that another year or so, and you look down the track, and you've got this massive day 2 problem where all of this glue code that LLMs have churned out starts breaking because producers are continuing to evolve their systems. And so we can't just rely on LLMs to crank out glue code that stitches stuff together today, because it releases, or it ignores the obligation for maintenance tomorrow. And so I think it's a lot more interesting to get to a point where we're using LLMs to help us categorize APIs, how to help us semantically document how APIs relate across the enterprise, and then let software that can read those machine readable specs autonomously navigate in real time, not create more code, but autonomously navigate like we do with in Google Map, and reroute when an API goes down, and do it in real time without requiring that kind of LLM regeneration cycle. Because I don't think that's the space where LLMs, as magical as they are adding the right amount of value.
Yeah, I'll be contrarian to Zohaib a little bit, I think, which is our job as colleagues, disagree and commit, I guess, is the LP. My feeling with the LLMs and the tooling and the ways to attach to ground truth, whether it's through functions or LangChain, I agree it's not there today, and but I don't agree it's never going to get there. I kind of think it is. So it's just I have this thing I do whenever I see a new model, or at least once or twice a month. I'll go and I'll ask it a problem that I think I don't know, I think it's a little bit tricky. I ask, what is 1/2 factorial? And for the longest time, I had to coach the LLMs to get the answer out of it. But after a while, the most recent, when I was using Claude Sonnet, and it had no problem. It was like, oh yeah, you need to use the gamma function and da-da-da. And like, wow, that, 2 months ago, it was like, you can't, factorial has to be an integer. So there's just a little example, but like these things are growing and they're growing pretty quickly. And I wanted to go back to something Paul mentioned, and the bad APIs and maintenance. I think the problem is as you say, it's like you build an API to serve what's right in front of you expeditiously. And it's no one's job to go back and, tend to the garden, I guess. And I think Paul, you've probably seen that internally to some extent. And I'm curious, like, what is your approach? Because I think in some sense with your new, what you're pointed at now in your firm, how do you address that? What is the care and feeding of the things in the rearview mirror plan? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's probably an old-fashioned solution, and then I think there's perhaps a newer solution that I'm hoping we'll start to see this year. So the old-fashioned one is you organize around it, right? And so we've done that, right? We have shared services teams. We've done that for a long time. And when you have a team that owns an API that is shared across, right, multiple consumers, it's a different behavior. The challenge with that is a little bit of scaling. It's a little bit of just, organizational challenges, let's just say. So I think we do well where we have those shared service teams that own. They're not the only ones that do well at it, but I think it's designed to a degree, it is designed to solve that problem. And those teams will sometimes implement something, call it sort of a one-off, right, for the need at hand. And maybe there is no other need at hand, perhaps, but when one does come along, right, they're there to recognize, yep, built that a year ago for that need. Now it's changed a little bit for the new consumer. We'll make sure we do the right thing. So that's the old-fashioned approach. I think it's just got an organizational scale challenge to it. The other one is, and I'm hoping we'll start to see this, is when we do get a portal with everything in it, I think it's going to have a side effect of exposing, didn't realize we had 6 things that go after transaction, this or that, right? And then I think maybe it's gamification, whatever it might be, where we start to, great, now we can see that we have the problem. Yeah, some people knew the problem existed because they knew they built something that probably could have been reused. But now it's going to be open to a wider audience. And so I think if we can start to use that to incentivize teams to do things differently or go back and change or clean up, I look forward to that.
Yeah,
Now,
I think that's a great point. Like
if you've got an easy button out there for me, I'm ready.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. Like, can we first show the problem, right? I don't think all of us probably. I think you're right that most developers and most people in the IT industry, especially in large enterprises, probably know this problem somewhere, buried inside their hearts somewhere. But I don't think everybody sort of understands the valence of the problem. So I think it's a great point that now you at least be able to see the problem and its extent, and that can drive some of the solutions. But the one more topic, and then we need to get to question answers. By the way, people who are listening, if you have questions, start posting them. We'll get to them. But one question worth talking about is that, of course, we're not the first people thinking about this problem, right? Over the decades, people have thought about this, right? There were some answers from the industry. For example, let's write this shared code, right? Or shareable code. So I will sort of wrap some of these things into some jar, right? Or somewhere, and then you can use some of it. So at least there's less problem with this orchestration to the point that you and Marty talked about, Paul. Others thought about different ways around documentation, right? So let's build good documentation, like what Zohaib was saying. But each of the solutions for somehow never lived up to it. So what were the reasons why couldn't shared code model or better documentation model just did not scale at an enterprise? What were the reasons?
I'm going to speak as someone who is at fault of this. I maybe people here would disagree, but I'm sure there are many people out there who would agree with me. I'm very picky about how I like to do documentation for a building, and that pickiness exceeds the needs of the many sometimes. I understand that it sounds a little dumb, but having worked with several different partners and several different companies in the past, I noticed that I was not alone in this. There are many different people who have their own specific types of documentation, specific, let's say, normal ways of doing documentation, their own processes, for example, or their own standards, I'll say that. I see that a lot of different companies, a lot of different people who like to do documentation their way. So there's always going to be, this happens a lot in healthcare as well. There's so many, I forgot what the patient healthcare, the record management system. So there's Epic, Cerner, Waze, Wells. Just if you throw a rock in a hospital, you hit a new different type of record service, because each type of physician has their own specific way of doing it. And there's no right way. So it's hard to create a standard. And that's my opinion, my relatively inexperienced opinion. If people disagree with me, we can disagree and commit like Tyler and I did.
I was thinking, Paul, as you were, sorry, Marty, Paul, as you were talking about, wrapping your head around the ocean of APIs and getting it in the context of a portal, I'm wondering if there's some machine learning techniques that can be thrown against that API set to whether it's kind of a k nearest neighbor thing, just to, as part of the maintenance. You see these things embedded and you see which things are similar in terms of what goes in and what comes out and the payloads and such. Might be interesting case to throw at that instead of just taking out your giant magnifying glass and looking for overlapping or duplicative code.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it could probably help us scale that recognition of, we have three things that do sort of suit the same purpose in our transactions, whatever space, right? So I think it could scale that activity. Otherwise, again, we're probably asking engineers who have full plate to do that, and they could have kind of done that already anyway. So yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. It still only, not to diminish the value of that in a sense, but it still only gets us to the point of knowing we have a problem and maybe having specific data about the problem. Unless you're also maybe thinking, not only could you can point the machine at it and you can figure out some of that, but it could also suggest you could eliminate this endpoint because it is the exact same inputs and outputs.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these are just tools that help. I mean, this is going to age myself severely, but when I started coding, like, I was coding in a text editor. It was VI or it was or worse, and then along came syntactic highlight, coloring and fonts and stuff like that, and that was amazing. Yeah, you could actually see what the keywords were. Then you get into IDEs and there's dot complete, and now we have things that are just writing SQL code or SQL connection code or file interaction code, and it'll write it for you. So I think in that sense, all of these are just tools that you're going to not even notice you're using at some point, but it'll just be part of it'll be in your quiver as a developer or a manager or an architect. Sorry, Marty, I think I jumped on you earlier.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I was just going to have a swing at answering the question, why didn't shared code, why didn't documentation, like, why haven't those kind of solved the problem. And I think, you know, organizationally, as organizations scale, they work better when you have autonomous teams that can ship, you know, on their own schedule, right? Where, you know, you have a large number of small teams is generally able to crank out more capability than one big team, right? But the key to that is avoiding coupling so that teams can move at their own pace and innovate and iterate at their own pace. And I think things like, you know, I think shared source code is one example of tight coupling between teams. You know, API specs are another example of tight coupling between teams, because if one team changes the API spec, other teams have to evolve. So it's another form of coupling. But the reason that those things have generally not been as productive, I don't know that I wouldn't go as far as to say that they failed, but the reason that they haven't been as successful as they were always hyped up to be is because the more consumers that these things get, right, the more widely distributed that shared code becomes, the harder it becomes to change, because the blast area of the blast radius of change is so big, the cost of change is so high. So we kind of, I think we've organized away from that to let me just operate on my own. And if duplication exists, you know, duplication plus velocity is kind of more appealing than standardization and stagnation, right? So I think we've kind of moved away from that a little bit, and I think that's also true for, you know, standardization of tooling. Teams want to be able to move on their own pace, and lots of competing standards is not a bad thing, because they encourage evolution, they encourage new ways of thinking, and, you know, organizations are heterogeneous at the technology level, and that's a good thing, right? Like enforcing standardization. I like the idea of kind of a little bit of anarchy within an enterprise, where people are just, you know, they're creating in the tech stack that allows them to be productive, and they're delivering value in it. And I always think that's kind of a little bit more attractive than standardizing on exactly one way of doing things that everybody has to come together and agree on. And just trying to form consensus around standardization is, like, it's tough. It's really, really tough. So I think those are some of the challenges around why maybe that hasn't worked as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, we have all seen shared services, and I think one of the problems with shared code, shared services work really well, as Paul can tell you. But I think you're right that the more consumers start using the same jar file, the same NuGet package, the same NPM package, it becomes harder and harder to change it. And then I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that de-incentivizes change, which is the worst thing you want. You actually want people to change, but now you've suddenly de-incentivized it so that people actually don't change, or people take the idea of backward compatibility too far, right? So I'll keep writing backward compatible contracts, but the point was at some point you're going to deprecate, right? And actually move on to the new contract. So what we see in most enterprises is that they actually do backward compatible contracts, but they never deprecate. So you end up having this contract which has like hundreds of attributes which are null, simply because they're carried over for 5 years. And it's really hard to make breaking changes. So it's like, it's again, it goes back to the perpetuating problem that sort of muddies the water a lot more. I think we are down to 4 minutes. I think maybe just one more topic to touch upon, going back to the solution space a little bit. To Paul, what you were saying was, I think GenAI, and maybe this is where I would probably disagree a little bit, Marty, with what you were saying in terms of the place LLM holds. I think Zohaib would probably agree that I don't think most of the successful scenarios where LLM will be used is where LLMs are the only people or the only system solving the problem, right? Like you already have ideas of React and other ideas where you probably have agents which will have more deterministic tools to solve the deterministic problems, and then probably hand off the non-deterministic part to LLM somewhat. So there could be a world in which API Marketplace, API Gateway, API Specifications, Taxi, Orbital, these are sort of tools used by LLM to orchestrate a final solution. So it's not like you have to go to LLM and say, give me the 3 APIs, and it tells you the 3 APIs, but it sort of figures out all the tools it has at its disposal, like a RAG way, but not just RAG, but really using these tools to find the final answer. And that could be the world in which we can see a short-term gain until, Tyler, to your point, we see a GPT-7 in 2 years, which might be able to do all of this, right? Like it's quite possible. I mean, we know that Gemini is already up to 2 million tokens, if I'm not wrong. They just released last week, right? Or 1 million or whatever. So the context window is increasing. So it could be possible, but in the short term, maybe there's a way to use some of these tools together and use LLM as an orchestrator, like a RAG architecture sort of thing, and actually get to that answer that we want.
Yeah, I think it's right now when you use an LLM and you try and do things like replicate a research analyst, you have to deliberately use something like tools or functions or LangChain to tell it, hey, when you're going for balance sheet, when you get a balance sheet question, go to the 10K and use this service, which will pull out the structured data, and then you're at ground truth, and you can be confident in that deterministic information and be explicit about it. But I think at some point, we're just not going to notice that behind the scenes, all the things that are deterministic are just getting handled. Like, give me a stock quote, give me this position, give me this this transaction set. It's not going to go to Google to find the transaction set. It's going to call the T row price transaction API, and it's going to return, good housekeeping seal of approval data, or whatever what's the sheep's name? I can't remember. The T row sheep.
Trusty.
Sorry?
Trusty, right?
Trusty. Okay, there you go. Trusty seal of approval data. Cool. I think we have a question.
Oh, we do have a question.
Yes.
Did you consider performance metrics of services when introducing AI to describe APIs? Go ahead, Zoe.
Actually, I was wondering, there's a lot of different performance metrics you can take into consideration. Probably more metrics than there are APIs that you could connect it to. Some of the ones that I think would be most important would be, I would say, throughput, tracking number of invocations, for training, just general CPU and GPU utilization, making sure that it's better optimized for depending on. So I know NVIDIA GPUs recently have been, I shouldn't say blowing up, have been taking off quite a bit. Model latency, I would say model accuracy and performance using precision, recall, F1, and the variety of different metrics there. There are also, specifically for AWS, SageMaker Neo has built-in performance metrics that I know we do use for testing in real-time metrics, and then if it drops below a certain threshold, then it would trigger for a manual view, making sure that something didn't go wrong that badly. At a high level, I think those are the main metrics that everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. I know we are at one. We are at one. I think this was a great conversation. I don't think we have enough time for concluding remarks, but I think all of us, I think, made our cases really well. It was a lot of fun talking to everyone. I'm hoping that something comes out of it. Maybe we do build a proof of concept and have another webinar where maybe we can just take a look at this future. I think a lot of interesting ideas came out of it. But if anybody has closing remarks, please jump in.
I'll just throw out a vote for maybe a future conversation. We'd focus on semantic search.
All right. You get it, Paul. We'll do it.
Zohaib, go write some code.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Marty. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Tyler, Zohaib, and everybody who was here. Thank you for listening, and we'll come back maybe with another webinar on the solution space this time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, all.